All right, so I'm going to just very quickly go over pixels versus vectors, or essentially what's the difference between Photoshop versus Illustrator. So just open up this PDF file, just called Pixel versus Vector, and it just very quickly has an example up top that talks about the way vector files save information. So the way they save it, it's more based on the grid. So if you want to, for example, draw a straight line, essentially what it's remembering is there's a single point at one location and then another point at a different location, and then it draws a line connecting those 2 points. And the same thing if you have a point that's at an angle, it doesn't necessarily remember that there's a 45-degree angle here, but it's more than anything remember that there's a single point here and a single point here, and then it's just connecting that with a single line. So that's essentially the way Illustrator works, a very basic way that Illustrator works. The way Photoshop works is slightly different. It uses something called pixels. So I'm just zoom into this example over here. Pixels or raster. So essentially what it's doing is within Photoshop, it doesn't necessarily know that there's a point here and a point here and essentially connecting the line. What it's remembering is there's a series of pixels that make up something that looks like a line. All right, so if I zoom in on this even further, the diagonal line is really starts to stand out as you can see the individual pixels. So again, it's not with Photoshop. It doesn't necessarily remember that there's a point here. It just remembers. It just knows that there's a series of pixels that are all connected. That gives the appearance of a line. So your Photoshop files are essentially just made up of a series of pixels, and because they're made up of a series of pixels, your Photoshop files will more than likely always be larger than your Illustrator files. So Photoshop is great for images, but if you're going to have line work, Illustrator is the best way to go. So another thing that just to know about with working in Photoshop, if you're unfamiliar with the way pixels work, essentially what you need to know is something that is called DPI or PPI. DPI stands for dots per inch. PPI stands for pixels per inch. And both of these are essentially used interchangeably, which technically DPI refers to the print and PPI refers to what you see on your screen. But either one pretty much means the same thing, so you can use those interchangeably. So essentially what this means is there's, I guess, three basic versions of resolution. So a 72 ppi is a low resolution, 150 ppi is medium resolution, and 300 is a high resolution. So essentially what that means is just imagine this is just a 1 inch by 1 inch square. So in the 72 pixels per inch, let me zoom in. What that means is per that 1 inch square, there are 72 pixels that run across the bottom and 72 pixels that run across the side. So again, if you were to add that up on the second row over, there's another 72. On the third, there's another 72, and so on. On the 150, you still have that exact same 1 inch by 1 inch, but now the pixels get much smaller because you essentially have to fit in 150 of these pixels going across. And of course, with the 300, it's the same thing. Imagine this being a 1 inch by 1 inch. And now the size of these pixels are much, much smaller because you have to fit in 300 of these pixels going all the way across. And I'll show you an example in about a minute. But I just want to very quickly explain two more things over here. Oh, let me zoom out a little bit. So the two basic color modes that we work in the most are RGB and CMYK. RGB stands for red, green, blue. RGB mode is best when you're viewing on your screen because it has a larger color range. And CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, black. And CMYK is the best mode for printing, but it does have a smaller color range. Um, if you do have your file set up as an RGB, you can still print it, but essentially what happens is all your colors get changed to CMYK mode right before it prints. And to save, there's a few different formats. PSD is your Photoshop format, which you always want to save your file as a PSD format, just to have it. And then the additional formats, a JPEG is a good one for compression. PNG is a good one for saving the alpha channel. And TIFF is just a good one because it's essentially universal and it can be read. It saves all your information, but because it's universal, your file sizes come out a little bit larger than usual. But you always want to have your original Photoshop document. So let me go in and show you an example of low resolution, medium resolution, and high resolution, what starts to happen between those. So I have these three files open. I have them open in Photoshop. So I have the pixel example at 72, pixel example at 150, and pixel example at 300. So I have all three of these open. I'm going to look at the pixel example at 72, go to image, image size, and what I can see over here is my width is 3 inches by my height is 3 inches, and the resolution is 72. All right, so I'm going to just take a look at the pixel example at 150, go to image, image size, and again, I see the same thing. It's 3 inches by 3 inches with a resolution of 150. And the pixel example at 300, same thing. It's set up at 3 inches by 3 inches with a resolution of 300. So I can see within all three of these, they're all 3 by 3. The only difference is the resolution, 72, 150, and 300. So I'm just going to open up a new Photoshop file. I'm going to say I'm going to print this, set this up just as a basic letter. So I have an 8.5 by 11. Again, here's my color modes, RGB or CMYK. I'll just leave it at RGB, leave it at 8-bit, the background white. The only thing that I want to change is my resolution. I don't want 300 just for this example. I'm going to change my resolution to a medium resolution or 150 pixels per inch and create this new file. So now that I have this new 8.5 by 11 board, I want to take each one of these images and place it in here. But I want to start off with the pixel example at 150. Right, I want to place this image into this 8.5 by 11. So I come over here, pixel example at 150. I'm going to come to my layers. I'm going to right click on where it says layer 0. And I'm going to go to duplicate layer. There's several different ways of doing this. This is just one way of doing this. So I click on duplicate layer. And essentially what I'm going to tell it to do is tell it where to make a copy of this new layer. I can make a copy within the same file, or the new file that I just made is called Untitled, right? Here's where it says Untitled 1. So I'm telling it to make a new copy in this new 8.5 by 11 document that's called Untitled. I hit OK. And if I click over here on Untitled, there it is. I just copied it over. I'm going to make sure I'm on the Move command and make sure you have Auto Select checked. And just move your file or move that image somewhere. Right. So now what I want to do is I want to take the pixel example at 72 and copy that into my new 8.5 by 11. So again, I come over here to layers, right click on layer 0, duplicate layer, make a copy of it in Untitled 1, hit OK. And now I come back over here. And I'm going to move these side by side and zoom in a little bit. The one thing that I notice is that the one that I originally moved in is larger than the second one I just moved in. So what just happened? So let me try to explain this. So we started off with, I'm switching back over to this pixel versus vector PDF example. So we started off with a file that was 150 pixels per inch, and I placed the image that was 150 pixels per inch inside this 8.5 by 11 that was 150 pixels per inch. Then what I did is I moved an image that was 72 pixels per inch into the one that was 150 pixels per inch. So essentially what had to happen was the size of this pixel now has to fit inside the size of this pixel. So it had to get smaller. So that's why these two images, even though they said they were 3 inches by 3 inches, that's the reason why this one is smaller. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move the one that is 300 pixel example at 300 into this board, right? So if you can guess what's going to happen, let me scoot over here. So I have this file 300 pixels per inch, right? I'm going to drag that into a file that is 150 pixels per inch, and can you guess what is going to happen? Let's try it. So pixel example at 300, put my layers, right click, duplicate, put it in untitled, okay. And there is the one at 300. And of course now it's larger than the one at 150. And again, what was happening, the size of this pixel is very small. So when I move this image over into this file, the pixel size needs to increase in order to fit, in order for this pixel to fit in this new location. Right? So it has to get larger. So that's essentially what happened. So now when you're dealing with Photoshop or working in Photoshop, not only do you have to keep in mind the overall size, this 8.5 by 11 inches, but now you also think about the pixel resolution, because that can, obviously, as you can see, it can now start to change the size of your images. Right. So just to save this as a specific format, again, I always want to save this as, let me zoom out a little bit. I always want to save this as a Photoshop file, right? I can also save it as a JPEG or as a TIFF or as a PNG. File, save as. Just place it on my desktop. Make sure you have it saved as a Photoshop file. If you want to change it to something else, you could always go over here, go to JPEG, go to PNG, go to TIFF. You could also save it as a PDF if you want for printing purposes. So I'm just going to save it as a Photoshop and save.